At 1:23 in the morning, on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl exploded, and almost immediately, the Soviet state began telling itself a lie. Not that the reactor was damaged, not that there had been a serious accident, but that disaster could still be contained inside the old habits of secrecy, denial, and delay. Welcome back to Dark Chronicles. This is the story of the first hours after Chernobyl, and the night the lies began. Chernobyl did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a system that prized image, hierarchy, and control. By 1986, the Soviet Union wanted nuclear power to look like proof of modernity. The city of Pripyat, built to serve the plant, was supposed to be a model Soviet future. Wide boulevards, clean apartment blocks, schools, cafes, and young engineers raising families under the shadow of atomic progress. That image mattered. It mattered politically, internationally, and psychologically. A reactor could fail. Machines always can. But the system around it was not supposed to admit failure, especially not at a facility tied so closely to Soviet prestige. That is why the Chernobyl story is not just about a reactor. It is about what happens when a dangerous machine is fused to a political culture that punishes bad news. On the night of April 25th into April 26th, plant staff prepared for a safety test at Unit 4. The goal was to see whether, during a loss of power, the turbine's residual spin could provide electricity for a brief window before diesel generators fully engaged. That sounds technical, and it was. But the important point is simple. The test was badly prepared, badly timed, and carried out on a reactor design that already had dangerous flaws. The men in the control room were not cartoon villains. They were operators and engineers inside a rigid hierarchy. Some had doubts, some followed orders, some were working with incomplete understanding of a machine that could become unstable at low power. A culture built on obedience met a design built with hidden danger. And just after 1:23 a.m., the result was catastrophic. There were 2 explosions. The reactor lid was displaced. The roof was wrecked. Fires broke out. Pieces of radioactive graphite and fuel were scattered around the site. But one of the most important facts about that night is this. Even after the explosion, some of the people in charge struggled to accept what had happened. Part of that denial was human. The idea that a reactor core could be blown open seemed almost impossible to people trained to think within the limits of official assumptions. Part of it was institutional. To say the core was exposed was to say the unthinkable had already happened. And in authoritarian systems, the unthinkable often gets delayed by language before it gets delayed by action. So while the reactor burned, confusion competed with reality. Firefighters were called to the plant, as if this were an industrial fire that could still be beaten back with hoses and courage. Men like Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik and other first responders arrived without truly understanding the radiation they were walking into. They climbed onto roofs, into smoke, and toward glowing debris that no normal firefighter should ever have been asked to face. Inside the plant and around it, dosimeters failed, readings maxed out, and critical information moved too slowly through a chain of command built for control, not truth. That first night was full of technical failure, but it was also full of informational failure. The people making decisions did not fully understand the scale of the disaster, and some of them resisted accepting it even as evidence accumulated around them. And while that was happening, Pripyat was still asleep. That detail is what gives Chernobyl its special horror. A reactor had exploded. Radioactive material was rising into the night. Firefighters were already receiving lethal doses. Yet only a few kilometers away, An entire city still existed inside yesterday's assumptions. By the morning of April 26th, residents of Pripyat could see smoke and an eerie glow over the station. Some later recalled a metallic taste in the air. Some went about their routines. Children played outside. Buses ran. Families looked out from balconies. Life continued because official life continued. And when states monopolize information, people often borrow their sense of danger from the behavior of authority. That is what the first lie really was. It was not just a false sentence spoken into a microphone. It was the continuation of normality after normality had already ended. There is a temptation to tell Chernobyl as a story of one explosive moment. But the deeper story is slower and more political than that. The explosion happened in seconds. The consequences were multiplied by hours of hesitation, disbelief, and bureaucratic instinct. Plant officials reported partial truths upward. Local leaders waited for direction. Moscow received fragments. The most dangerous thing in those first hours was not just the invisible contamination. It was the gap between reality and the willingness of the system to name reality. Pripyat was not evacuated on the night of the explosion. It was not evacuated in the morning either. The city was finally evacuated on the afternoon of April 27th, roughly 36 hours after the reactor exploded. By then, buses had been assembled in one of the largest emergency transport operations in Soviet history. Residents were told to take only essentials and expect to be gone for a few days. Many believed they would come back. Most never did. That evacuation is one of the central images of Chernobyl. Families stepping onto buses under the direction of a state that had waited too long and still was not telling the full truth. Not because every official understood the whole situation and cynically narrated it in private, but because the machinery of secrecy kept producing delay even when delay had become dangerous. The Soviet Union still hoped, at first, to manage the crisis as an internal problem. But Chernobyl would not remain Soviet property. Radioactive particles do not respect borders, and the atmosphere has no ideology. On April 28th, workers at the Forsmark nuclear plant in Sweden detected unusual radiation on their clothing and shoes. At first they suspected a local problem. Then checks made it clear the contamination had come from outside Sweden. Once that happened, the disaster could no longer be contained inside Soviet silence. The world began to understand that something major had happened in the USSR before the USSR publicly acknowledged the scale of it. That is one of the most humiliating facts in the whole story. The outside world learned something was terribly wrong before the Soviet public was told plainly. Only after international detection and pressure did Moscow issue its first brief public statement through the state news agency TASS. Even then the language was cautious and thin. An accident had occurred. Measures were being taken. Assistance was being provided. That was true. It was also radically insufficient. Because by then, the story was already bigger than one reactor and one city. It was becoming a global story about credibility, about whether a superpower built on secrecy could survive a disaster that made secrecy self-destructive. The cover-up did not mean there was never any response. Thousands of people responded. Firefighters, plant workers, helicopter crews, soldiers, engineers, miners, doctors, and later the liquidators all became part of a massive mitigation effort. Nor does the cover-up mean every official acted with malicious clarity. Chernobyl was also a story of confusion, fear, compartmentalized information, and leaders struggling to grasp something outside their experience. But none of that erases the central fact that truth moved too slowly. And the slowness had consequences. It shaped public exposure. It shaped public trust. It shaped the memory of the event. Even official life continued in ways that told citizens not to panic. In Kyiv, May Day celebrations still went ahead on May 1st, even as anxiety and rumors spread, and the scale of contamination was becoming harder to deny. The symbolism was almost unbearable. Ritual public confidence, performed in the shadow of a disaster that confidence had already failed to prevent. This is why Chernobyl matters beyond nuclear history. The accident was technological. The catastrophe became political. A flawed reactor design and an unsafe test triggered the explosion. But a system of prestige, fear, and delayed truth deepened the damage. That interpretation is not just hindsight. Over time, even Soviet leaders recognized the political meaning of what had happened. Mikhail Gorbachev would later suggest that Chernobyl did more to undermine the Soviet system than many reforms did, not because it physically destroyed the state, but because it exposed the moral weakness inside the state. A government so afraid of the truth that it endangered its own citizens by trying to manage appearances first. And that is why the 40th anniversary matters. Chernobyl is old enough now to become symbol before it remains history. People know the name. They know the image of the abandoned city. They know the glowing reactor in pop culture. The masks, the sarcophagus, the warning signs. But what often gets blurred is the timeline of denial. The fact that the first disaster was the explosion, and the second was the refusal to admit what the explosion meant. If you want to understand Chernobyl properly, do not begin with the exclusion zone as a ruin. Begin with the hours when officials still spoke as if the system was intact. Begin with the men in the control room trying to fit an impossible event into an old mental script. Begin with Pripyat going through a normal morning under an abnormal sky. If you want to go deeper after this episode, the best next step is Adam Higginbotham's Midnight in Chernobyl, which is still the strongest narrative account of how the accident unfolded, and how secrecy distorted the story almost from the first minute. I've linked that, plus the Audible trial, in the description. The easiest way to misunderstand Chernobyl is to treat it as a freak accident. It was not. It was an accident shaped by design flaws, human decisions, institutional fear, and a political culture that mistook silence for control. That is the part history keeps trying to warn us about. Systems built on image can survive small lies for a long time, but when reality becomes too large, the lie does not protect the system. It exposes it. So when did the Soviet Union lose control of Chernobyl? At 1:23 a.m., when Reactor 4 exploded. Or in the hours after, when the truth was still treated like the most dangerous thing in the room. Tell me what you think. If this story deserved to be told, subscribe. There are hundreds more like it.